Last thing to add on to the chapter 1 and 2 notes is the 68, 95 and 99.7 percentage rule. This is when we want to show our data how many standard deviations we are from the mean. So when you actually get marked by VCAA, they like to put all the data on a bell curve. So a bell curve is when we have symmetric data that looks like this curve, and they call it a bell curve. 68% of the data should fall in one standard deviation above the mean and one standard deviation below the mean. So this 68% of the data, that's nearly the majority of our information they want in one standard deviation above and below the mean. Above one standard deviation is 16% of the data, and below one standard deviation is 16% of the data. So 100% of the data falls in this breakdown. Then two standard deviations from the mean, we have the 95% rule. So two standard deviations above and two standard deviations below the mean is 95% of our data, and then the rest falls above two standard deviations or below two standard deviations. The last rule is the 99.7% rule, where we have three standard deviations above, three standard deviations below. That's 99.7% of our data, and the breakdowns are above three standard deviations and below three standard deviations. Knowing these breakdowns is very, very important. It's great knowing the rules, the three numbers of the rules, but knowing how these break down is important. So in this three standard deviations, it's knowing that three standard deviations above the mean is 49.85%. From the mean below to three standard deviations is also 49.85%. These two added together make 99.7. The leftover and halved, because we've got half above three standard deviations and half of the leftover below three standard deviations, is broken down to, as we can see, 0.15% of these standard deviations. Knowing these breakdowns is very, very important. They quite often will give you a number. Say they might say there's 1,000 people have been surveyed. How many people surveyed were, in this example, over one standard deviation? So you just need to work out what 16% of 1,000 is. Knowing these breakdowns, so important. Another question they might say, how many, over what number is 84% of the data? So knowing how to break down these, we've got 16% below one standard deviation. That means 84% is above one standard deviation below the mean. Knowing these breakdowns, I can't stress how important that is. So 68, 95 and 99.7 rule, but knowing the breakdowns that these fall